Welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update for Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, Phineas Newborn Jr., his biography and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first is a dual album compilation taken from two different sessions called Phineas Rainbow and While My Lady Sleeps, a compilation of solo performances, trio and quartet tracks. Some of his best solo pieces, Angel Eyes and Autumn in New York, highlights from his group performances, Land's End and She Means Everything to Me, classics by Harold Land and George Shearing. Another album called Fabulous Phineas, released in 1958. This was one of his all-time best albums and established him as a leading jazz pianist of his time. Joining him on the tracks is a selection of musicians with a diverse range of styles, which made for a very funky compilation of music. Also, Phineas' brother Calvin makes an appearance on this album. Another album called Harlem Blues, released in 1975. On this album also, he's joined by his star collaborators Ray Brown and Elvin Jones on bass and drums. The songs on this album are very diverse, ranging from peppy up-tempo songs to slow ballads. Some of the highlights: Cooking at the Continental, Stella by Starlight and Tenderly. So that was a quick recap of what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. Welcome to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, it's all about the biography and best hits of Phineas Newborn Jr. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first is a dual album compilation taken from two different sessions called Phineas Rainbow and While My Lady Sleeps, a compilation of solo performances, trio and quartet tracks. It was still the early days, and even back then, Phineas shows a lot of technical mastery, whether performing solo or in ensemble format. Some of his best solo pieces, Angel Eyes and Autumn in New York, beautiful covers of each song. Highlights from his trio performances, Land's End and She Means Everything to Me, classics by Harold Land and George Shearing. He also takes us through some original compositions that he composed alongside his brother Calvin Newborn, two great hard bop compositions called Clarisse and Overtime. Calvin's on guitar on these tracks. Also, many critics have said this is one of his best piano and string instrumental albums of its day and age. Another album called Fabulous Phineas. This one was released in 1958. On this album, he performs alongside a trio. This is one of the albums that established him as one of the best jazz pianists of his time. And he is indeed fabulous on the tracks, especially a great solo that he performs on the song Cherokee. Also outstanding is a selection of musicians that accompanies Phineas on the songs. They were specifically selected for their diverse styles, and the result is one of the funkiest albums Phineas ever produced. There's Calvin Newborn, George Joyner, Denzel Best and George Shearing. Critics have said this album was jazzed in the Memphis tradition, and many of the musicians hail from Memphis. Calvin Newborn, Phineas' brother, really gets a chance to showcase his individual skills on this album. Another star from the lineup, Denzel Best, who plays with great taste and flowing rhythms on percussion. Phineas himself is his usual energetic self, and the song Phineas Rainbow brings them together with some great group chemistry. Another album called Harlem Blues, released in 1975. In this album also, he's joined by his star collaborators Ray Brown and Elvin Jones on bass and drums. So this album is a diverse mix of up-tempo and slow-paced tunes, peppy songs like Ray's Idea and Cooking at the Continental, and slow ballads like Stella by Starlight and Tenderly. The material is very diverse in range and allows all three musicians to stretch out to show their flair. Brown's accompaniment on bass alongside Newborn's piano playing was always a highlight of their collaboration in perfect synchronicity. Jones is very powerful on drums, adding a touch of dynamism to the entire musical. The opening track, Harlem Blues, shows us what's in store. Right off the bat, things get very energetic as Newborn opens up with some energetic piano. Then Jones and Brown join in, and the tempo picks up even further. On Stella by Starlight, we get a glimpse of the classical. Newborn was also heavily influenced by the classical music. Brown has a great bass solo on the song Tenderly. Jones always matching that stride, driving the music along, providing the momentum to the music. So that was a quick insight into more of Phineas Newborn Jr.'s best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, it's all about Phineas Newborn Jr., his life and times and best hits. Now it's time for some trending album news. David Bixley is a New York-based saxophonist and composer. He's announced a new album called Incognito Ergo Sum. On this album, he's collaborating with Dan Loomis and Fabio Rojas. The album is set for release on June 26th. The Bixler trio started out performing for parkgoers in New York City, and a lot of that energy is apparent in this album. This is also the follow-up album to their very first ever of its kind, an album called Inside Grief, which was released during the pandemic and themed on those times. So Incognito Ergo Sum is all about the freedom of human expression, taking down boundaries and borders in the spirit of unity. It draws inspiration from bebop, jazz, rock and Venezuelan folk music. It's a celebration of artistic anonymity with collective intention. So on this album, there's a lot of great original compositions by the bandmates. The music is also driven by improvisation, great rhythms and moments of stillness. Also ahead of the album release, the trio will be promoting their album at a CD launch on June 24th at D-ROM in New York City. For more information, please visit www.davidbixler.com. So that was some trending album news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Phineas Newborn Jr.'s best albums of all time. Stay tuned. This is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, it's all about Phineas Newborn Jr., his life and times and best hits. During this summer, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first one's called A World of Piano, released in 1962. This one was one of the best jazz piano albums of the 30s. Newborn recorded alongside members of the Miles Davis Sextet and the Cannonball Adderley Sextet. The overall vibe is soft, relaxing and gentle. Songs like Lush Life, Cheryl and more. Another album called Solo Piano, released in 1974. On this album, we see Bud Powell's influence on Newborn's playing style. There's a variety of tracks, meditative, gentle ones like Willow Weep For Me and dynamic ones like Bouncing with Bud. Another album called Please Send Me Someone to Love. On this album, Newborn is joined by longtime collaborators Elvin Jones and Ray Brown. The three of them thresh out some beautiful vintage classics, mainly hard bop songs. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, it's all about Phineas Newborn Jr., his biography and best hits. During this summer, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called A World of Piano, released in 1962. When this album came out in the 30s, critics hailed it as one of the best albums of the era. It was recorded at two trio sessions, one featuring members of the Miles Davis Sextet and another featuring Cannonball Adderley Sextet. This one's a very up-tempo swinging compilation of songs. Most of the tunes were just compositions. There's also a beautiful ballad by Billy Strayhorn called Lush Life. The music flows through Newborn as he plays, very relaxed and soft and gentle in contrast with the swinging vibe of the album. The opening track, Cheryl by Charlie Parker, is one of the best swingers. Another Dizzy Gillespie classic, Manteca, featuring some great improvisation. He plays like Cecil Taylor or Oscar Peterson on this one. They were famous for their complex style of playing. He also improvises a lot on the song Lush Life by Billy Strayhorn, mingling his own melodies with the original composition. Also a great song full of intense rhythms called Dahood. Another great blues song originally composed by Horace Silver called Juicy Lucy. Probably the most complex song on the album is a waltz called Forcal. Another album called Solo Piano, released in 1974. This is another great album by Newborn. The style here is not quite studio or concert but more of a barroom style of play. So Newborn's style was derived mainly from Bud Powell's style. We see influences of this especially on tracks like Bouncing with Bud. Another album called Please Send Me Someone to Love, released in 1969. This album was one of two that Newborn recorded in 1969. The other was a legendary album called Harlem Blues. On this album, he's joined by longtime collaborators Elvin Jones and Ray Brown. The two musicians had frequently performed alongside him, and they were great for his complex style of play. Phineas himself was a whiz on blues songs, and that comes across on this album. Also at the time, the jazz landscape was undergoing a lot of changes, and Phineas playing here is in like vein, very groundbreaking and innovative. Elvin Jones is very powerful on drums, while Ray Brown provides the bass melodies to add momentum to the songs. The songs they perform are blues and bop songs like Come Sunday, Black Coffee, Rough Riding and more. So that was some insight into more of Phineas Newborn Jr.'s best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Phineas Newborn Jr., his life and times and best hits. We've come to an end of this week's episode of the Jazz Update, so now let's recap what we were discussing during this program. To start off with, an insight into his biography. He was mainly inspired by the styles of Bud Powell, Art Tatum and Oscar Peterson. In time, Phineas went on to rank among some of the most prodigious pianists in jazz. His performances took him from solo works to orchestral performances in clubs, concert and international tours. In his early years, he would tour and perform in local clubs with his family members, mainly R&B music. In the 50s, he switched to jazz after Count Basie discovered his talents. Throughout the 50s and 60s, he produced some outstanding piano records both as sideman and band leader. So that was a bit of insight into his biography, and here's a peek into some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Here Is Phineas, released in 1956. This album introduced Phineas to the world as a great improviser and technician on the piano. Many critics have compared his playing style to that of Bud Powell and Art Tatum. Some highlights from the album: I'm Beginning to See the Light, Afternoon in Paris, also one of his own compositions, Newport Blues. Another album called The Great Jazz Piano of Phineas Newborn Jr., released in 1963. Joining him on the album was Leroy Vinnegar on bass and Milt Turner on drums. The album opens up with a great bebop track, a tribute to Bud Powell, a song called Celia. The original essence of the Bud Powell track is maintained, but nevertheless Phineas covers it with his characteristic energy and harmonic depth. Another song by Bobby Timmons. This one's a sparkling take on a soulful jazz classic. There's also some of his own compositions like Theme for Bessie. The album went on to become a hit album in Phineas' compilation. Another one called A World of Piano released in 1962. This was one of the best jazz piano albums of the 30s. The overall vibe is soft, relaxing and gentle. So that was a quick recap of everything that we discussed on this week's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Yashani Selva. We've come to an end of this week's episode of the Jazz Update, but you can check out the archives of today's show on my YouTube channel, the Weekend Jazz Update with Yashan. So on that note, I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.